My name is Deborah Langford, and I'm 56 years old. At a dinner meant to plan my younger sister's wedding, my mother slid a printed spreadsheet across the table, looked me dead in the eye, and told me it was time I finally contributed something real to this family, because, in her exact words, I didn't even own the roof over my own head. 4 days later, my sister's wedding planner was going to call me by a title neither of them had used for me in 20 years, the owner. Before I tell you what happened at that dinner, and everything that came after it, do me a favor. Tell me what time it is where you are right now, and where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. To understand why that dinner went the way it did, you have to understand my family first, and you have to understand what I've spent the last 20 years quietly not telling them. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, the older of 2 daughters from my mother's 2 marriages. My mother, Joan, married my father young, had me at 22, divorced him before I turned 6, and remarried a man named Harold a few years after that. Isabel, my half-sister, though I've never once called her that out loud, not even in my own head, came along when I was 15. My mother doted on her in a way she'd never quite managed to with me, and by the time Izzy was old enough to notice anything, she'd absorbed the family's unspoken rule, the way children absorb rules nobody ever has to say out loud. Izzy was the daughter you celebrated. I was the daughter you managed. I watched it happen to her too, in the opposite direction, over the years. Izzy brought home a C- in 9th grade algebra once, visibly upset about it, and my mother sat with her at the kitchen table for 2 hours, hired a tutor within the week, and framed the eventual B+ like an Olympic medal. I don't say this with any bitterness toward Izzy, to be clear. She didn't ask to be the child who got the tutor, any more than I asked to be the one who didn't, but I understood, watching that unfold from the doorway with my own homework tucked under my arm, exactly which one of us my mother believed was worth the investment, and which one of us she'd simply decided would figure it out alone, because I always had. I think about a specific afternoon sometimes, from when I was about 11, not long after Izzy was born. I'd made the honor roll that semester, the only time in 3 years I'd managed straight A's, and I came home with the little certificate rolled up in my backpack, genuinely proud of it, rehearsing on the walk home exactly how I'd hand it to her. My mother was in the middle of a phone call with her sister about baby formula, Izzy asleep on her shoulder. She glanced at the certificate, said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," in the exact tone you'd use for a child showing you a rock she found in the yard, and went back to her phone call before I'd even finished unrolling it all the way. I taped it to the inside of my closet door instead, where nobody else would see it, and I looked at it there for years. I don't think there was ever one specific day my mother decided Izzy mattered more than I did. It was 1,000 afternoons like that one, stacked up over 45 years, until the stack became the entire shape of our family, and by the time I was old enough to notice the shape, it had already hardened into something that looked, from the outside, almost like normal life. I went into real estate at 26, starting small, a duplex near the historic district that I bought with a down payment I'd saved for 4 years, working 2 jobs while I finished my licensing courses at night, eating the same 6 meals on rotation because eggs and rice were cheap, and I was not going to ask my mother for a dime. I remember mentioning the duplex at a family dinner not long after closing, genuinely excited, the way you're excited about the first real thing you've ever built, entirely with your own 2 hands. I closed on a property this week, I told them, still a little stunned by my own signature on the paperwork. A duplex near the historic district. I'm going to rent out one side and live in the other. My mother set down her fork, mid-bite, and asked whether that meant I'd finally be able to help out more with Izzy's college fund, since I'd clearly have money to throw around now. Harold nodded along, adding that it was good I was finally being practical with my finances. Nobody asked what the building looked like, or what the mortgage payment was, or whether I was scared, which I was, or proud, which I also was. I said something non-committal about the college fund and changed the subject to dessert. I didn't bring up real estate at that table again for almost 20 years. That wasn't dishonesty, not the way I understood it at the time. It was self-preservation. Every single time I'd shared something I was proud of, my mother had found a way to turn it into a bill I apparently owed the family. So I stopped sharing, and I kept building, one property at a time, quietly, through a holding company with a name that meant absolutely nothing to anyone at that table, Coastal Heritage Properties. 20 years later, it owned 11 buildings across the historic district, several of which the city considered structurally irreplaceable, and a small staff who called me Ms. Langford in meetings I never once mentioned at Sunday dinner. My mother believed I rented a one-bedroom apartment downtown. That much, at least, was technically true. What she didn't know was that I owned the entire building it sat inside of, and had for 11 years. I learned the habit of keeping my numbers to myself from a woman named Carol Ann Pruitt, who sold me that first duplex and, over the years, became something between a mentor and a friend. Never let people who didn't help you build it vote on what you do with it, she told me once, over coffee, not long after I'd made a mistake, mentioning a good year to a cousin who'd shown up 2 weeks later needing a loan I never fully got back. I took Carol Ann's advice more literally than she probably intended. I didn't just stop discussing money with people who hadn't helped build it. I stopped discussing almost anything about my work with my family at all, because I'd learned, the hard way, that with them, there was no such thing as a small disclosure. Every number I gave them eventually turned into a number they thought they were owed. By the time of that dinner, my days looked nothing like the picture my family carried around of me. I spent my mornings walking properties with contractors, arguing gently but firmly with the Historic Preservation Board about window replacements, and most evenings reviewing leases at my kitchen table with a glass of wine and a rescue dog named Baxter asleep against my feet. It wasn't glamorous, most days. It also wasn't a black hole. It was, if anything, the fullest and most deliberately built life I knew how to make, brick by brick, mortgage by mortgage, entirely on my own terms, which was, I think now, exactly the part my family had never once had the curiosity to ask about. The dinner happened at a restaurant Izzy picked, 3 weeks before her wedding, to a man named Julian Marsh, whose family owned a marina and, according to my mother, practically half of River Street. Izzy had been planning the wedding at a restored carriage house downtown, the Bellhaven, a beautiful old building with exposed brick and a private courtyard, the kind of venue that books out a year in advance and photographs like something out of a magazine. 2 days before this dinner, a vendor issue with the catering deposit had left them short on the final venue payment. $28,500. That was the number my mother slid across the table on a printed spreadsheet, the way you'd hand someone a bill they hadn't noticed they'd already run up. The restaurant was the kind with cloth napkins and candles in glass hurricanes, the kind Izzy had picked, specifically because it felt like a preview of the wedding itself. Harold sat at the far end, mostly quiet, the way he'd been mostly quiet at every family dinner for 30 years, occasionally nodding along to whatever my mother said with the particular loyalty of a man who had learned decades ago which side of every argument was actually his to have an opinion on. "We need this by Friday, or we lose the deposit," my mother said, folding her hands on top of it, like the matter was mostly settled. "I know it's a lot, but we thought, since you don't really have anyone else to spend it on." I didn't answer right away. I was doing quiet math on other things entirely, the grant paperwork sitting on my desk back home, the roofing contractor I had scheduled for that exact building the following week, but my sister mistook my silence for hesitation, and she filled it the way she always fills silence, by making it worse. "It's not like you're using it for anything real," Izzy said, not unkindly, in the tone of someone stating an obvious fact she assumed everyone at the table already agreed with. "You don't even own the roof over your own head, Debbie. You just throw money into a black hole every month and call it independence." Nobody at that table blinked. That was the part that stayed with me longest. not the sentence itself, but how unremarkable it sounded to everyone hearing it. My mother nodded along, already reaching for her wine. Julian studied the dessert menu with sudden, profound interest. This was simply what my family believed about me, stated out loud, at a dinner table, in the same tone you'd use to mention the weather. A black hole. That was almost funny, coming from the one person at that table who had never once, in her entire life, asked what I actually did with my money, only ever what I could do with it for her. I kept that thought entirely to myself and reached for my water glass instead. I told them I needed a few days to think about it. That answer did not land well. Izzy accused me of always making everything difficult and brought up, for what felt like the 400th time, a family ski trip 6 years earlier that I hadn't helped fund, as though that one refusal had permanently defined my entire character in the years since. My mother added, more gently, but no less pointedly, that family was supposed to show up for each other, and she'd always hoped I understood that, even if I didn't have children of my own to understand it through. I told them I'd think about it. What I didn't say, what I never said, that night or any other, was that I already knew, to the dollar, exactly what was sitting in that venue's operating account, because I read those numbers every single month, and had for 2 years. Izzy showed up at my building the next evening, unannounced, buzzing my apartment from the lobby I owned, and she believed belonged to a management company somewhere out of state. I let her up. She sat on my couch, twisting a tissue in her hands, and ran through the argument again from a slightly different angle. How this was supposed to be the happiest month of her life, how she couldn't believe I'd let money get between us again, how Julian's family must think our whole side was a mess. I listened. I didn't correct any of it, though I could have corrected quite a lot of it, starting with the walls around her. I just need an answer by Friday, she said, at the door, hugging me stiffly on her way out. Please don't make this into a whole thing, Debbie. I told her I heard her, and I meant it, even if she couldn't yet hear the several things I wasn't saying back. 2 days later, sitting in my home office with a mug of coffee going cold beside me, I dialed into a call I'd had on my calendar for weeks, a routine check-in with Owen Faust, my property manager, about the Bellhaven's ongoing facade restoration. We're still on track for the grant inspection next month, Owen said, flipping through something on his end. Oh, and I confirmed the wedding booking for later this month, the Langford Marsh party. Coordinator's been wonderful to work with, very organized. I sat very still for a second, the way you do when 2 separate parts of your life suddenly turn out to be standing in the exact same room. I hadn't put it together until that sentence. Of course they'd booked Bellhaven. It was the best venue downtown, and I'd quietly kept its rental rates below market for 2 years running, because I liked what a full calendar did for the whole block. At almost that exact moment, 40 miles away, my sister was building a case against me in the family group chat, forwarding a screenshot of my "I need a few days" text to 3 cousins and an aunt, asking whether anyone else thought it was kind of insane that I wouldn't help with something this important to the family. While she was drafting a paragraph about my selfishness, I was reviewing a line item for new copper gutters on the exact building she believed some faceless hospitality company owned. I didn't say anything about that either. I finished the call with Owen, thanked him for the update, and went back to my coffee. My mother called the following evening, guilting me into attending the final walkthrough that Saturday. The least you could do is show up and see what we're begging you for, she said, and because some habits take longer than 20 years to fully unlearn, I went. The Bellhaven looked beautiful that afternoon, restored brick warm in the late sun, string lights already hung for a different event the week before, the new HVAC system I'd approved, humming somewhere quietly out of sight. Izzy walked through it glowing, talking about how lucky they were to get this place, how it just felt like it was always meant to be theirs. She ran her hand along the exposed brick near the courtyard door, brick I'd personally signed off on repointing 2 summers earlier, after the mortar had started failing in a way that worried the historic board, and said, to nobody in particular, Can you believe some company just lets it look this good and doesn't even charge what it's worth? I could in fact believe that. I'd made the decision myself, twice a year at renewal. Julian's mother mentioned, twice within 10 minutes, that their own family practically owned River Street, in a tone that made clear she considered this a point of comparison worth making at a stranger's expense. I said very little. I noticed the restoration details only an owner would notice, the new mortar work along the east wall, the temporary signage for the grant-funded facade project, tucked discreetly near the courtyard gate where nobody in a wedding party would ever think to look. Nobody else in that group so much as glanced at it. I told Julian's mother that River Street sounded lovely. I did not mention the grant paperwork sitting on my desk at home with this exact building's address printed at the top. I let Izzy have that walkthrough. I let her believe, for one more week, that some anonymous company had simply gotten lucky enough to own the prettiest building in the historic district. She'd find out soon enough who had actually made all of it possible, right down to the rate she'd never once questioned. That night, my mother called again, this time in tears, or something close enough to tears that I couldn't be entirely sure which. If you don't help with this, everyone in the family is going to know you chose money over your sister. Again. That last word did the work it was built to do. Again. As though there had been a first time. As though I had spent my whole life choosing anything over the people who had never once, in 56 years, chosen me back first. I sat with my laptop open that night for a long time, a transfer already drafted. $28,500, ready to send, my thumb actually hovering over the button. 20 years of quietly building something entirely my own, and one guilt-soaked phone call had me halfway to writing a check to prove I loved a family that had never once, at any point, asked me a real question about my life. Funny. For a woman who thought I owned nothing, my mother certainly knew exactly which number to call the moment she needed something from the nothing she assumed I had. And then I thought about the sentence from the dinner table. You don't even own the roof over your own head. I thought about how easily that line had come out of my sister's mouth, and how nobody at that table had so much as paused before agreeing with it out loud, in front of Julian, in front of the waiter, refilling our water glasses. I put the phone down. I didn't send the transfer. The next morning, I called Owen and told him to handle the Belhaven paperwork exactly the way he'd handle it for any client on the books. No special instructions, no quiet discount extended out of guilt, the way I'd extended one without ever telling anyone for 2 straight years. Let it play out exactly as it already was. I want to be clear about what that decision actually was, because I think it's easy to mistake it for something colder than it is. I didn't call Owen to expose anyone. I wasn't interested in a confrontation, and I certainly wasn't interested in punishing my sister during her own wedding week, out of spite, dressed up as justice. I called because I was finished quietly managing everyone else's comfort at the direct, ongoing expense of my own truth. I just let the paperwork be exactly what it had always, technically, already been. The final signing happened 4 days later, in the courtyard of the Belhaven, with most of the wedding party present for a walkthrough of the day of timeline. Natalie Cho, the wedding planner, pulled a folder from her bag partway through the meeting. "Before we wrap up," she said, scanning the group, "I just need the owner's signature on the updated access agreement. The facade crew needs a signed window for Thursday morning before the ceremony setup starts." She looked up, found me near the back of the group, and said, easily, like it was the most ordinary request in the world, "Ms. Langford, if you don't mind." Izzy laughed, confused, already halfway through correcting her. "Wait, I think you mean my mom, or, actually, I'm not totally sure who you—" "She's the owner," Natalie said, matter of fact, sliding the folder toward me, across the little courtyard table. "Coastal Heritage Properties. Deborah's been wonderful to work with on the grant timeline, honestly. The whole renovation's basically been on her dime the last 2 years." The courtyard went very quiet. I signed the paperwork the way I sign every piece of paperwork, plainly, without ceremony, while I watched my mother's face do the exact arithmetic I imagine most mothers eventually do, the moment the numbers finally arrive, not the dollar figure, but the years. The duplex I'd mentioned once at a dinner table 2 decades earlier. The company name that had meant nothing to anyone. The rent that had somehow never once gone up under my mother's own reading of the situation, because I had simply never mentioned that I was the one who had never raised it. Izzy looked, for the first time since I'd walked into that restaurant 3 weeks earlier, genuinely lost for words. I watched her do the same math in real time, every generous rate she'd thanked some faceless hospitality group for, every kindness she'd assumed was pure coincidence, had been coming, quietly, from the sister she'd just told, in front of her own future mother-in-law, that she owned nothing. Julian, who had spent 3 weeks mostly studying menus and centerpieces, while the women in his new family argued around him, looked up from the folder like he was seeing the whole afternoon for the first time. "Wait," he said slowly, glancing between me and the freshly signed agreement. "You're the landlord my dad's been emailing about the parking easement." I told him yes, that was also me, and watched him recalibrate his future mother-in-law's entire family in real time, the way people do when a quiet relative turns out to be load-bearing. Harold, standing near the courtyard gate with his hands in his pockets, said only, "Well, I'll be," which was, for Harold, roughly the emotional equivalent of a standing ovation. Julian's mother, to her credit, recovered fastest, in the specific way people recover when they realize they've been discussing real estate with the actual owner of the real estate in question. Coastal Heritage restored the Ashby building too, didn't they? She asked, already recalculating the entire conversation from 20 minutes earlier. I told her yes, 2 years ago, and thanked her for asking. It was, I noticed, the first genuinely curious question anyone at that wedding had asked me all month. "You could have just told us," my mother said finally, quietly, not quite an apology, not quite anything else either. "I did tell you," I said, 20 years ago, at a dinner table, when I mentioned buying a duplex, you asked if it meant I could contribute more to Izzy's college fund. I paused, not unkindly. "I heard you that day, Mom. I don't think you ever actually heard me." Izzy found her voice a minute later, quieter than I'd heard her all month. "The rate," she said slowly, "the rate was never actually market, was it?" "You've been," she stopped, unable to finish the sentence, doing the math on 2 years of a kindness she'd never once thanked a real person for, because she hadn't known there was a real person to thank. "I liked what a full calendar did for the block," I said. "It wasn't a secret so much as it was just never anyone's business but mine." Nobody yelled. I didn't gloat, and I didn't offer to waive the $28,500 as some grand, cinematic gesture. That particular ask had already answered itself, standing right there in the courtyard, in the shape of a building none of them had ever known was mine. What happened instead was smaller, and I think, in its own way, far more honest. A family that had spent 3 weeks treating my privacy as a personal flaw finally understood, all at once, that it had actually been a mercy they'd never once thought to ask about. I stayed through the rest of the walkthrough. I answered Natalie's remaining questions about the courtyard timeline the same way I'd have answered them for any other client, and when it was over, my mother walked me to my car, quieter than I'd seen her in years. 20 years, she said, mostly to herself, like she was still doing the arithmetic. I had no idea it had been that long. "I know," I said, and I meant it kindly, because underneath everything else, I did feel something kind toward her in that moment. But I stopped waiting for someone to ask a long time ago. I just kept building anyway. Izzy called me 2 nights before the wedding, close to midnight, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. "I keep replaying the black hole thing," she said, without any preamble at all. "I've been trying to figure out how I said something that awful and didn't even hear myself say it." I told her I appreciated that, and that I hadn't expected an apology delivered at midnight 2 days before her wedding, and she laughed, a little wetly, and admitted that was probably fair. We talked for almost an hour, longer than we'd talked about anything real in years, about the duplex, about Carol Ann, about 2 decades of dinners where I'd quietly decided the subject of my own life wasn't worth the trouble of raising. I didn't tell her everything that night. Some things take longer than one midnight phone call to hand over. But I told her enough, and for the first time in longer than I could easily count, my sister asked me a question about my life, and then actually stayed on the line for the whole answer. The wedding happened on schedule, the following month, in the courtyard I'd watched being restored, one grant application at a time. I signed the final access agreement, approved the vendor gate list, and sat in the second row in a pale green dress, and when Izzy came down the aisle past the new mortar work on the east wall, she caught my eye for just a second and mouthed, silently, "Thank you. Not for the $28,500 I never sent, but for something closer to 20 years of a truth she'd finally been let in on." At the reception, Julian's father found me near the bar and shook my hand like he was meeting a colleague for the first time, which, in a sense, he was. "I hear we've got the same building inspector," he said, and we spent 20 minutes talking about historic preservation grants while our 2 families danced 20 feet away, neither of them looking over at us even once. It was oddly one of the more comfortable conversations I'd had at a family event in years, with a man who wasn't family at all, who had simply asked me a real question and then waited around for the real answer. So here's what I want to say, in case any part of this sounds like your family too. Your quiet is not the same thing as your confusion. Your privacy is not the same thing as deception. Your quiet phone calls, your quiet contracts, your quiet 20 years of building something nobody asked to see the receipts for, none of it needed an audience in order to be real, and none of it needed their belief in order to count. Your success was never a report you owed to people who only valued you the moment they needed something from you. Your years of building something real, with nobody watching and nobody keeping score, were never a debt that only starts counting once somebody finally notices it. And your worth was never something you had to prove by handing over whatever number they demanded, on whatever schedule they decided for you. I liked what a full calendar did for the block, I told Julian's mother that afternoon, and I meant it. But I think, looking back, what I actually liked was building something no one could take a vote on. Something that was, for once in my life, entirely mine to decide about, in a family where almost nothing else ever had been. So tell me honestly, if you'd spent 20 years quietly building something real, would you have corrected the room the very first time they called you a failure to your face? Or would you have let the truth arrive exactly when it was ready, the way I did? I want to know where you land in the comments. Whatever you felt watching this, you're allowed to feel it. This story is fictional, written for reflection and entertainment, but the lesson underneath it is real enough. You are never required to explain your success to people who only ever asked what it could do for them. Sometimes the quietest answer is simply letting the truth show up on its own schedule, standing in a courtyard, holding a folder nobody expected it to be holding,